The storm had been brewing all morning, and by late afternoon, it had descended in full fury. Sheets of rain battered the streets of this small coastal town in Virginia, and the wind whipped the harbor into a frenzy. Inside the little diner by the docks, the smell of fried fish and brewed coffee offered a comforting reprieve from the chaos outside. Patrons hunched over their meals, their conversations muted, voices blending with the low hum of the old neon sign buzzing overhead. It was the kind of ordinary place where everyone thought they knew everyone, where secrets were few and rumors even fewer. Claire Donovan sat in her usual corner booth, a steaming mug of black coffee in front of her, untouched. Her long auburn hair was pinned back neatly, though a few strands clung to her damp forehead from the wind outside. She stared through the rain-streaked window at the harbor, her green eyes reflecting the storm, calm and unyielding. She appeared ordinary, almost fragile, like someone who could be overlooked, forgotten. But there was a quiet intensity in the way she held herself, the kind of intensity that didn't go unnoticed by those who had met her before, or those who would pay attention if it mattered. Her focus was interrupted by a commotion at the entrance. The diner door slammed open, rattling the bell above it, and 3 men stepped in, shaking off rain from their jackets. Their presence shifted the air immediately. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered and scarred, a permanent sneer etched into his features. Another was lean, wiry, twitching nervously, eyes darting around as though sizing up everyone in the room. The third, shorter but muscular, carried himself with an air of menace that demanded attention. Their laughter, loud and brash, cut through the low murmur of the diner like a knife. "Another slow day, huh?" The leader called out, his voice dripping with mockery. They approached the counter where a young waitress balanced a tray of food, her hands trembling slightly. The tallest of the 3 snatched a plate from her hands, sending eggs and toast clattering to the floor. The diner went silent for a moment. The only sounds were the rain and the muted flicker of fluorescent lights. Claire's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. Her body remained still, but her mind shifted into a state of absolute awareness. She noticed everything: the scuff of the men's boots on the linoleum, the faint scent of alcohol and cigarettes on their clothes, the way their eyes darted, constantly seeking dominance. Her training, long buried under years of civilian life, began to resurface, each instinct sharp and precise. "Hey, watch it," the waitress stammered, trying to reclaim the plate. The leader laughed, a low, menacing sound. He stepped closer to Claire's booth, eyes narrowing. "And who's gonna stop me, sweetheart?" He sneered. The tension in the diner thickened. A few patrons looked away, pretending not to see the unfolding confrontation, while others shifted in their seats, unsure if they should intervene. The air felt heavier, charged. Claire didn't move immediately. She simply studied him, her gaze steady, unflinching. Her voice, when it came, was calm, but carried the weight of unspoken authority. "You'll put that down," she said. He laughed again, louder this time, and in a swift motion, he grabbed her by the throat, lifting her slightly from her seat. The diner seemed to slow around them, the clatter of the fallen plate, the hiss of rain against the windows, the frightened gasps of the waitress. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Claire's eyes didn't waver. There was no panic, no fear. Instead, there was calculation. Claire's hand shot up in an instant, twisting his wrist with precision. The crack of bone echoed through the diner. His eyes widened, shock and pain mingling, as he dropped her, stumbling backward. The other 2 men tensed, exchanging nervous glances. They had expected compliance, resistance perhaps, but not this. Not someone who could counter so quickly, so efficiently. She stood, rising fully to her feet, her posture relaxed but ready. "Back off," she said, her voice cold and measured. "Now." The tall man lunged toward her again, but Claire was already in motion. She pivoted, using his momentum against him, sending him sprawling onto the wet linoleum. The diner erupted into chaos as chairs toppled and patrons ducked under tables. But Claire moved with the fluidity of someone who had spent years mastering her body, years training to survive in situations where hesitation meant death. It wasn't just the physicality that was striking. It was the calm in her eyes. The way she held herself suggested she had faced far worse than a few drunken, entitled men. She was controlled, precise, and terrifyingly efficient. "Call the sheriff," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else, as she assessed the remaining threat. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the storm-tossed harbor in stark white. The sound of thunder rolled through the diner, echoing the rhythm of her pulse. In that moment, Claire Donovan wasn't just a woman in a small Virginia town. She was a force honed by years of Navy SEAL training, a professional conditioned to hold her breath and her fear for longer than most could imagine. The last man hesitated, unsure if he should attack or flee. He had counted on her being weak, ordinary, frightened, and she was none of those things. Claire's eyes locked onto his, a silent warning passing between them. She wasn't going to escalate unless forced. But if she had to, there would be no stopping her. The sheriff arrived minutes later, the siren barely audible over the storm. Claire stepped back, letting the authorities take over as the men crumpled where they stood, gasping for breath and nursing bruised pride. She returned to her booth, picked up her coffee, and took a slow sip, letting the warmth anchor her after the adrenaline surge. She wasn't a hero by choice that day, nor did she seek recognition. But in the quiet aftermath, as the storm raged outside and the diner returned to its muted rhythm, the town would remember the woman who didn't flinch, who held her ground, and whose calm gaze could stop a man dead in his tracks. It wasn't just the strength in her arms or the precision in her movements that left an impression. It was the presence, the undeniable aura of someone who had mastered fear itself. In that small, rain-soaked diner, Claire Donovan reminded everyone that sometimes true power was silent, patient, and impossibly deep, like the ocean she would one day disappear into. And as the rain poured, she whispered to herself, almost inaudibly, "Fear wastes oxygen." The diner had returned to its uneasy calm, the storm still raging outside, but inside, the air felt charged, electric. Patrons whispered in low tones, some stealing glances at the woman who had, in a matter of seconds, turned the tables on 3 rough men who had dared threaten her. Claire Donovan sat in her corner booth, coffee untouched once again, observing the aftermath with a clinical eye. She noticed the small details, the slight tremor in the hands of the waitress, the scattered utensils, the way the men's eyes darted even as they nursed bruises and swelling pride. She had survived worse than this, though. Far worse. A flicker of movement in the corner caught her attention. The leader of the group, the one who had first dared to grab her throat, was attempting to rise again. His jaw set, face twisted with fury, eyes burning. He hadn't yet understood that Claire's calm was not a weakness, but a weapon. In a fluid motion, honed through years of rigorous training and instinct, she stood, her body low, ready, her breathing steady and controlled. Every muscle, every fiber of her being remembered drills and maneuvers long buried under civilian life. "You shouldn't have done that," the man spat, lunging at her with reckless aggression. Claire didn't flinch. She had trained to anticipate attacks like this countless times, underwater and in the field, when hesitation could mean death. With a precise sidestep, she used his momentum against him, twisting his wrist and flipping him over her shoulder onto the hard linoleum floor. The sound of his body hitting the ground reverberated through the diner like a warning drum. The other 2 men froze, unsure if they were facing a woman or a storm incarnate. Her movements were a dance of control. Each strike, each pivot, was executed with intention, conserving energy while maximizing effect. Years as a Navy SEAL had taught her that strength alone was useless without timing, anticipation, and control of one's environment. Every glance around the room counted, where objects could be used for leverage, which patrons could be shielded from harm, every route for retreat or attack. "You still want to fight?" she asked softly, almost disbelieving that he hadn't yet understood the danger. The man hesitated, just a fraction of a second, long enough for Claire to close the distance. Her hand shot out, striking the side of his knee, sending him sprawling onto a booth. She didn't scream, didn't shout. She simply observed, controlled, and waited for the moment when the fight would be over. In those few seconds, memories surfaced, vivid, almost surreal. The freezing waters of training pools, instructors screaming underwater while she fought against the instinct to breathe, the weight of oxygen deprivation pressing against her chest. The grueling exercises that pushed her lungs past pain, forcing her to stay calm when everyone else would have panicked. Each flashback reminded her of a single truth. Control over breath and mind was more powerful than brute strength. Outside, the storm lashed against the diner windows, lightning flashing across the darkened harbor. Inside, every second was a heartbeat. Patrons held their breath, watching the drama unfold. The man on the floor groaned, attempting to rise again, but Claire was faster. She had already positioned herself between him and the remaining threat, the two accomplices, who still stood frozen near the counter. One tried to rush her, but she pivoted smoothly, using his momentum to send him crashing into the edge of a table. Splinters flew. He groaned, clutching his shoulder. The leader staggered to his feet once more, desperation flashing in his eyes. "You'll regret this," he growled. But Claire was already moving, every motion precise, rehearsed, instinctive. She grabbed the nearest chair, swung it effortlessly to block his path, and then dropped low, delivering a strike to his midsection that left him gasping. The din of the diner, the hum of neon lights, the clatter of fallen dishes, the muted thunder outside seemed to fade. In that moment, it was only her and the men, a controlled storm within a storm. Her breath remained calm, measured. That was part of her power, and it showed in every movement. She had learned long ago to hold her breath longer than most could imagine, to remain underwater for minutes at a time while executing precise tasks, missions where the margin for error was zero. It wasn't just physical. It was mental dominance. And now, in the fluorescent light of a small diner, that training came alive. The last two men began to retreat, slowly at first, realizing that brute force would accomplish nothing. But the leader, stubborn and enraged, made a final charge. Claire anticipated his move perfectly. With a deft twist, she sidestepped, grabbed his arm, and sent him crashing into the counter. The impact rattled the metal legs and sent a cup of coffee flying across the floor, steaming and forgotten. He fell, groaning, completely immobilized. Claire exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, letting the tension leave her body. Her hands remained relaxed, her stance calm, but her eyes continued to scan the room. She had neutralized the threat, but the lesson was clear. Threats rarely came announced, and power often hid in ordinary forms. In the diner that day, no one saw a woman overwhelmed by three men. They saw a force of nature in human form, calm, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective. Sheriff Miles arrived minutes later, having been called by a terrified waitress. He took in the scene, a diner in disarray, chairs overturned, men nursing minor injuries, and a woman standing almost serenely in the corner. "Claire," he began, his voice a mixture of surprise and concern. "Are you?" "I'm fine," she said. "They aren't." He looked at the men, incredulous. "You didn't even—" "Fear wastes oxygen," she interrupted, a slight, almost imperceptible edge to her words. The sheriff froze, the phrase echoing in his mind. He didn't fully understand it, but instinctively, he knew it carried weight. Claire Donovan wasn't just strong. She was in command of herself in ways he couldn't fathom. And as the storm continued to rage outside, he realized this was not the last anyone would see of the woman who moved like water and struck like lightning. Once the men were taken away in police cars, groaning and defeated, Claire returned to her corner booth. She sipped her coffee at last, savoring the warmth and calm after the whirlwind of adrenaline. Patrons began to whisper among themselves again, the hum of ordinary life slowly returning. But in the shadows, in the storm-lashed harbor outside, a quiet tension remained, a reminder that sometimes the ordinary world brushed against something extraordinary. And when it did, the results were unforgettable. And as she watched the rain cascade into the harbor, Claire allowed herself the briefest smile, the echo of a memory from a far colder, far more dangerous world, the icy water, the deafening silence beneath the surface, the knowledge that the world could only hold you down if you let it. She had survived that, and she would survive this. Because Claire Donovan wasn't just any woman in a small Virginia diner. She was a Navy SEAL, and the calm before the storm was just her beginning. The diner was quiet now, but the storm outside had not relented. Rain pounded the windows with relentless force, and the harbor beyond was a churning mass of gray waves. Claire Donovan walked slowly along the pier after leaving the diner, her coat pulled tight against the wind, boots splashing through puddles. The adrenaline from the earlier encounter had faded, leaving behind a cool clarity that only years of rigorous Navy SEAL training could instill. Each breath was deliberate, each step measured. Her mind replayed the events of the afternoon with forensic precision. The three men, their crude movements, the way the leader's eyes had flickered with disbelief when she had countered his attack. Most people, she knew, would have panicked under such pressure. Most would have screamed, frozen, or fled. Not her. She had trained for moments like this. Moments where instinct, timing, and control determined life and death. And while this encounter was minor, compared to missions she had survived, it reminded her of a truth she never forgot. Fear wasted oxygen. She reached the edge of the pier and paused, leaning against the railing. The harbor stretched out before her, waves slapping against pilings, boats rocking in the storm. She closed her eyes, inhaling slowly, counting in her mind. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her breath was steady, slow. In the past, this method had saved her life countless times. It was not just a way to calm herself. It was a survival tool, honed through years of holding her breath underwater during grueling SEAL endurance exercises. She had once held her breath for over 5 minutes while performing complex underwater tasks, each second a battle against instinct, against panic, against oxygen-deprived muscles. Her thoughts drifted back to the cold training pools of Coronado. She remembered the sting of chlorine in her eyes, the sound of instructors barking orders from the surface while she struggled against exhaustion below. The water had always been unforgiving, as were the instructors. Breathe through the pain, they would yell. She had learned to ignore the scream of panic in her mind, to focus on precision, control, and timing. Now, walking along the pier, she could feel that training replaying in her muscles. In the subtle way she shifted her weight, poised for movement if necessary. The memory was interrupted by movement at the far end of the dock. A shadow detached itself from the darkness. One of the men from the diner, perhaps scouting or testing her. Her green eyes narrowed. She stepped lightly, boots making no sound against the wet wood. Her training allowed her to sense subtle cues, The way someone moved, the rhythm of their breathing, even the slight change in their weight. This was more than perception. It was anticipation. She could act before the threat fully materialized. The man stepped closer, cautious, underestimating her. He had not yet realized that Claire Donovan was more than humanly calm in situations that would terrify ordinary people. Without a word, she sidestepped him, her hand flashing to grab his wrist and twist with a fluid motion learned in countless drills. He stumbled, lost his balance, and fell against a piling, gasping for air. His companion, further down the dock, froze at the sound, their plan dissolving in panic. Claire exhaled slowly. Her pulse was steady. The man's groan echoed faintly through the rain, but she remained unaffected. This was a game of patience, of control, of endurance. And she was the master of it. Her mind, trained to operate under extreme conditions, parsed every threat in the storm-lit harbor. Every element, the wind, the rain, the sound of waves, even the occasional creak of a boat tied to the dock, became part of her situational awareness. And then, as her breath slowed further, she remembered why she had left the SEALs. The memory hit her suddenly, unbidden, like a tidal wave. It was the mission that had ended in failure, the dive where a teammate had slipped beneath the waves, lost despite every effort she had made. She had watched him go, trapped in silence, unable to reach him in time. That guilt had driven her from service, driven her to this small town, to a life she had hoped would be quiet. Yet the skills she carried, the control of breath, body, and mind, were not things one could simply leave behind. They were part of her, as permanent as the water that had once claimed her comrade. Her feet moved again, silently, along the wet planks. Another shadow moved near a stack of crates. Her heart rate remained calm. Her breathing was slow, deliberate. She had trained for this, for scenarios that demanded more than strength, for moments when patience and timing were everything. She waited, calculating, anticipating, until the right moment arrived. When the man stepped forward again, perhaps thinking she had been unarmed or distracted, Claire struck. Her hand shot out, catching his shoulder and twisting with precise force. He went down, unable to resist the momentum, crashing into the crates with a wet thud. Rainwater splashed around them, mixing with the sweat that had accumulated during the encounter. She took a step back, surveying the area. One threat remained, watching from the shadows. Claire's breathing did not falter. Her mind counted silently. 60, 70, 80. Seconds passed in slow, deliberate increments, each breath a meditation, a weapon, a shield. She had learned to survive when oxygen was scarce, when panic threatened to overtake logic. Every movement, every decision, now flowed from that foundation. And when she finally moved toward the last man, he froze, sensing that the calm woman approaching was not merely capable, but lethal. "You've underestimated me," she said softly, almost to herself, though the words carried. Her hand flicked outward in a controlled strike, knocking him off balance and sending him sprawling to the wet planks. The storm raged on, deafening, but in that moment, the dock belonged to her. Every wave, every gust of wind, every creaking board became part of the rhythm of survival. Minutes later, she stood alone, rain-soaked and silent, surveying the harbor. The men had fled, leaving her unchallenged, yet her mind remained alert, scanning the dark edges of the dock for further threats. She knew this encounter was only the beginning. These men were small players in a much larger game, one that she now understood was moving closer to her doorstep. Claire closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, feeling the cold water mist on her face. Her lungs expanded, her pulse slowed, and she remembered the mantra that had sustained her through the most impossible missions. Breathe, see, act. Tonight, it had saved her life once more. And she knew deep in her core that the coming days would demand more than just skill. They would demand endurance, courage, and a mastery of fear that few humans could ever achieve. She opened her eyes again, green and resolute, staring into the darkness of the storm-lashed harbor. The docks were empty, but she could feel them, the threats lingering, waiting. Claire Donovan was ready. She always had been. And she would survive what was coming, because the ocean, the storm, and the steel within her refused to let her fail. The night was darker than usual, a black curtain broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the storm-tossed harbor. The wind whistled through the rigging of docked boats, carrying with it the scent of salt, gasoline, and something darker, the unmistakable tang of danger. Claire Donovan moved along the edge of the pier, silent and deliberate, her boots splashing softly in puddles. The adrenaline of the diner encounter had faded into a simmering alertness, every muscle in her body tuned to detect the faintest anomaly. Tonight, she knew, the threat was larger than 3 drunken men. She had sensed it earlier, a subtle shift in the air when she approached the docks. Footsteps that did not belong, shadows that lingered too long, the distant murmur of voices beneath the storm. Someone was watching. Claire's eyes narrowed, adjusting to the dim light as her mind catalogued every sound, every movement. The SEAL training embedded in her muscles and mind kicked in instinctively. Silent observation. Anticipate. Control. 2 figures emerged from behind a stack of crates, their silhouettes partially hidden by the storm. The men from the diner, not all of them, but at least one scout, had returned, this time cautious, deliberate. But Claire's instincts told her they were not alone. The way they moved, the way they scanned the area, suggested direction and coordination. These were not ordinary criminals. They were professionals, part of an operation that had been using the docks as a cover for illicit activity. Claire's mind raced, connecting the dots. Trafficking, smuggling, exploitation, the kind of operations that hid in plain sight. These men had underestimated her once, but now she understood their reach. They had a network, and she was at the center of it. Her pulse remained steady, her breathing calm. She had trained for high-stakes operations where patience and precision mattered more than brute force. This was no different. She slipped behind a stack of crates, keeping low, her eyes scanning. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating. The scene, 2 men by the dock edge, crates of goods stacked haphazardly, a boat rocking gently in the storm. One of the men was on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. Claire's ears caught fragments of the conversation. "She's back. We need her out of the way." The words confirmed her suspicions. Claire didn't hesitate. She moved closer, silent as the night, using the storm as cover. Every step was deliberate, every movement controlled. Her training reminded her that the element of surprise was her greatest weapon. She could confront them directly, but that was inefficient. She needed to observe, plan, and strike at the perfect moment. The 2 men didn't notice the small ripple in the shadows behind them, the subtle shift of movement across the wet boards. Claire crouched low, her body a coiled spring. The scent of rain mixed with gasoline, oil, and adrenaline. She remembered. The dives, the underwater drills, where she had to remain completely silent, invisible, while performing complex maneuvers. Those lessons applied here: patience, restraint, and the power of anticipation. Then, a 3rd figure appeared, taller, broader, the unmistakable leader. Mason Cole. His presence exuded authority, danger, and the kind of cruel intelligence that made ordinary confrontations lethal. He scanned the dock, eyes sharp, searching for any anomaly. His men froze slightly at his presence, a subtle shift in their posture, their loyalty evident in the way they mirrored his movements. Claire's mind raced. She was outnumbered, but not outmatched. She knew her strengths: precision, timing, control, and her advantage: surprise. The storm masked her approach, the dark hiding her from view, the chaos in the harbor giving her cover. She slipped closer to the group, noting the ropes coiled. By the crates, the tools scattered across the dock, the small boat waiting silently at the edge of the pier. Her pulse remained steady, her breathing deliberate. She counted silently. 1, 2, 3. Each beat aligned with her movements, her senses heightened. She had trained for situations where panic meant death. This was no different, except that the consequences were more immediate. A misstep could end her life, or the lives of those she had vowed to protect. The first man moved closer to her position, unaware of her presence. Claire adjusted her stance, preparing for a single, precise strike. She needed to incapacitate him silently, efficiently, without drawing attention. Her fingers closed into a controlled grip, her muscles coiled. One swift movement, and he was down, unconscious before he even realized the danger. The others remained oblivious, focused on the harbor and their tasks. Claire didn't linger. She pressed forward, moving from shadow to shadow, cataloging each threat. Her mind calculated the risk, assessed escape routes, and determined the optimal approach to confront Mason Cole without losing the advantage. Every detail mattered. The wet planks beneath her feet, the sway of the boat, the unpredictable wind carrying sound across the harbor. Mason Cole finally noticed the subtle disruption, a shadow that moved against the storm, a ripple of disturbance in his controlled world. His eyes narrowed, and he barked orders. The men around him stiffened, their casual confidence replaced by unease. Claire's presence was now undeniable. She stepped fully into view, drenched from the storm, eyes sharp, movements deliberate. The water splashed around her boots, but her posture remained calm, controlled, unshakable. "You shouldn't have." "Come back," Mason said, voice low and dangerous, carrying across the wet planks. Claire's response was calm, almost whisper-like, but it carried authority. "I'm already here." The first attack came, fast and desperate. One of Mason's men lunged toward her, hoping to overwhelm her with numbers. Claire moved with reflexes honed in the harshest conditions imaginable. A pivot, a precise strike, and the man collapsed to the dock, groaning. Mason's eyes flickered with surprise and irritation. He had underestimated her again. The storm raged around them, waves lashing against the dock, wind whipping the water into frothy spray. Claire remained steady, eyes scanning, muscles coiled, mind calculating. She knew this was only the beginning. Mason Cole was organized, ruthless, and clever. But Claire had survived worse. Underwater missions, combat scenarios, life or death drills where failure wasn't an option. Her breath remained slow, controlled, each inhale and exhale a weapon, as potent as any fist or strike. She advanced, silent but unmistakable, forcing Mason's men into defensive positions. They were disoriented, unsure how to handle a single woman who moved with such precision, such calm, and such deadly efficiency. Claire's eyes never wavered. Every move she made was measured, deliberate, anticipating their reactions and exploiting their weaknesses. And then, for a moment, everything slowed. The storm, the water, the shouts of men, as if time itself had paused to watch this confrontation unfold. Claire Donovan, Navy SEAL, master of breath and composure, stood ready, poised to confront Mason Cole in his criminal network. She was calm, precise, and terrifyingly effective. The docks, the storm, and the shadows had prepared her for this, and she would not falter. The night air was thick with rain, and the storm had intensified, lashing the harbor with wind and waves. Claire Donovan moved along the dock silently, calculating every step. Mason Cole's eyes had followed her, sharp and calculating, and his men were no longer hesitant. They were determined. One misstep, 1 second of hesitation, and the encounter could become deadly. She knew that. Before she could act, a strong hand gripped her arm, yanking her backward. She stumbled, instinctively twisting to break free, but the strength of multiple attackers overwhelmed her. The world tilted, rain stinging her face, as she felt herself being shoved toward the edge of the dock. Panic flared in their eyes, but not in hers. Claire Donovan had trained for situations far worse than this. The cold water engulfed her before she could react, swallowing her in icy darkness. The shock stole her breath for a fraction of a second, but her body remembered instinctively what to do. She kicked, twisted, and sank, counting silently. 1, 2, 3. The cold pressed against her chest like a vice, but she welcomed it. Her Navy SEAL training had conditioned her to remain calm under extreme pressure, to conserve energy while thinking clearly, even when oxygen was scarce. Above the surface, muffled shouts reached her ears. Mason Cole's voice barked commands, his men searching frantically. They assumed she was at a disadvantage, that the water would defeat her. They had underestimated the one element that was always under her control, her breath. She forced herself deeper, letting the water swallow her whole, the storm above fading into white noise. Memories surged, icy training pools in Coronado, instructors screaming, the panic of trainees failing under pressure, the blinding sting of cold water, the muffled cries of a drowning world. Claire's lungs burned, muscles cramped, but her mind was calm. She had once held her breath for over 5 minutes while performing underwater tasks, navigating obstacles with precision. She drew on that memory now, channeling every second into survival, into strategy, into calm. Her fingers searched along the ropes binding her wrists. She found the knot, evaluated the tension, and remembered the escape techniques drilled into her by instructors who demanded perfection. The water muffled her movements, but Claire's training allowed her to adapt. She manipulated the ropes, twisting her thumb and wrist, exploiting the smallest weakness. The cold bite of water made every motion more difficult, but it also sharpened her focus. Above her, shadows moved, light flickered, and the faint silhouette of Mason Cole appeared, gesturing violently to his men. Claire timed her movements precisely. One more twist, one sharp movement, and her hands were free. She flexed them slowly, conserving energy, then adjusted her body to maintain stability in the turbulent water. She could feel the ocean around her, a force of nature she understood, respected, and now used to her advantage. She propelled herself upward, carefully, silently. The surface broke, the storm hitting her face, the cold wind biting at her skin, but she emerged behind the nearest attacker. He didn't see her until she struck. The element of surprise was absolute. Her movements were swift, controlled, and precise. A single strike to the base of his neck sent him sprawling into the water. The others turned, too late to anticipate her presence. Claire didn't pause. She used the chaos to her advantage, leveraging the slippery dock and the storm to outmaneuver her enemies. One by one, she neutralized them, silent, efficient, and calculated. Her breath control allowed her to remain calm, despite the freezing water soaking her clothes, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, and the imminent danger surrounding her. Each exhale was deliberate, each movement perfectly timed. The final confrontation came with Mason Cole himself. He moved toward her with a weapon, confident, arrogant. But Claire's mind was already ahead of him. Every instinct screamed in harmony with years of training. She sidestepped, grabbed his arm, and used his own momentum to hurl him off balance. The water crashed around him, the storm amplifying the sound, drowning out his shouts. Claire's control over herself, over the environment, over the chaos, was absolute. As Mason struggled to regain his footing, Claire emerged from the water, calm and poised. The storm reflected in her eyes, green and unwavering. "This ends tonight," she said quietly, almost to herself, but the force behind the words was unmistakable. He faltered, recognizing the truth he had ignored for too long, that she was not only alive, but untouchable in ways he could not comprehend. The dock fell silent, save for the roar of the storm. Mason Cole's men were incapacitated, either unconscious or retreating, and their leader's arrogance had crumbled. Claire's body shivered from the cold, but her mind remained clear, focused. She had survived the water, the capture, and the trap. She had demonstrated the lethal combination of skill, preparation, and mental endurance that had defined her since her SEAL days. Claire stepped fully onto the dock, water dripping from her hair and coat, surveying the scene. She had learned, through years of rigorous training and extreme conditions, that survival depended not on panic or brute force, but on calm, controlled mastery of body and mind. Tonight had proven it once more. She allowed herself a brief moment to breathe deeply, savoring the control, the precision, and the fact that she had survived an encounter that would have ended most others. But she knew this was only the beginning. Mason Cole was not a lone wolf. He was part of a larger operation, one that would not forget the humiliation of tonight. The storm was far from over, both outside and in her life. Claire Donovan adjusted her posture, focusing on the horizon. The water was behind her now, the immediate threat neutralized. But the fight was far from finished. She had proven to herself that no trap, no underestimation, and no overwhelming force could break her, not when she could hold her breath longer than fear itself. Her eyes scanned the docks one last time. The storm raged on, but the immediate danger had passed. Claire Donovan, Navy SEAL, survivor, and master of calm under pressure, was ready for what came next. And she knew that whatever Mason Cole planned, whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them, controlled, calculated, and unflinching. The night was far from over, but she had already won the first battle. And in the quiet moments between the storm and the waves, Claire felt the power that came from truly mastering herself, her breath, and the world around her. The storm continued to rage, but Claire Donovan was no longer on the defensive. Her body was soaked, muscles burning from exertion and the icy water, but her mind was sharper than ever. The initial shock of capture had passed, replaced by a focused, surgical precision. Every instinct, every memory of grueling SEAL training, every second of breath control, now directed her toward one goal: neutralize the threat before it could escalate further. Mason Cole's men had scattered, some retreating toward the warehouse. At the far end of the docks, others frozen in place by the realization that the woman they had underestimated could no longer be ignored. Claire's eyes scanned the chaotic scene, cataloging each position, each potential hazard, and each line of escape. She moved with purpose, each step deliberate, silent, yet charged with authority. The storm's fury masked her approach, wind, whipping rain into her face, lightning briefly illuminating her path as she advanced. Her first target was a man crouched near the crates, still recovering from the strike she had delivered in the freezing water. He scrambled for a weapon, but Claire was faster. A precise strike to the wrist knocked the knife loose, sending it spinning into the wet planks. Without hesitation, she followed with a low sweep to his legs, bringing him down with minimal effort but maximum efficiency. He groaned, trying to regain balance, but Claire was already on the move, her attention scanning the remainder of Mason Cole's forces. The storm played to her advantage. The wind and rain were disorienting, masking her movements and amplifying the chaos. She used the terrain expertly. Crates, ropes, and dock supports became extensions of her tactical awareness. Every motion was calculated to conserve energy while inflicting maximum disruption. Each opponent she faced became a puzzle to solve, an obstacle to overcome, and she solved them all with efficiency born from years of combat training. Mason Cole, watching from the far end of the dock, realized too late that he had misjudged her. His voice cut through the storm, shouting commands, attempting to rally his men. But the cohesion of his team was fractured. Fear, confusion, and exhaustion had begun to take hold. Claire's presence had turned the tide psychologically before the physical confrontation was complete. Confidence shifted to doubt, and hesitation crept into every movement. She advanced toward him, moving like water over the wet wood, fluid, adaptable, precise. Lightning flashed, illuminating her soaked figure, eyes glowing with resolve. Mason's arrogance faltered, replaced by recognition of a truth he could no longer deny. Claire Donovan was not just a formidable opponent. She was unstoppable under these conditions. Every strike she had executed had been deliberate, every movement a lesson in control, patience, and lethal efficiency. As she closed the distance, Claire analyzed Mason's stance, predicting his actions. He swung a blunt pipe in her direction, an attempt to intimidate, to gain leverage. But she sidestepped with perfect timing, letting his momentum carry him forward. With a swift pivot, she used his own body weight to topple him over a stack of crates. He hit the ground hard, the impact reverberating through the dock. The weapon clattered uselessly beside him. The remaining men hesitated, uncertainty in their eyes. Claire capitalized on the pause. She moved among them with swift, deliberate motions, neutralizing each one with minimal effort, but maximum effect. A well-placed strike to a knee, a quick twist of an arm, a sudden push that sent a man into the cold water, each action precise, leaving no room for error. Her breath remained steady throughout, each exhale controlled, a testament to her training and her mastery over fear. One of Mason's men attempted a desperate flanking maneuver, but Claire anticipated it instantly. She pivoted, blocked the strike, and delivered a calculated blow that incapacitated him without allowing time for recovery. The storm roared around her, masking her movements, yet she was acutely aware of every sound, the splash of water, the creak of wood, the panicked murmurs of her adversaries. She was in complete control of the environment, turning every element of the storm to her advantage. Finally, only Mason Cole remained conscious, sprawled on the wet planks, his confidence shattered. He struggled to rise, desperation flashing in his eyes. Claire stood over him, unwavering, water dripping from her hair and clothes, her expression calm, composed, and terrifying in its serenity. She had turned the tide completely, and he knew it. His network, his carefully orchestrated plan, had crumbled before a single woman whose skill, patience, and courage far exceeded their expectations. "You underestimated me," Claire said, quietly, almost gentle, though the weight behind her words was undeniable. "That was your mistake." Cole tried to speak, to argue, to assert control, but his voice faltered. He realized that every option he had relied upon, fear, intimidation, numbers, had failed him. Claire had dismantled them all, using superior strategy, precision, and calm mastery. The dock, the storm, the chaos of the night had become her allies rather than obstacles. The storm began to subside slightly, rain still falling, but less violently. Claire allowed herself a brief moment to breathe deeply, filling her lungs with cold, clean air. Her muscles ached, her clothes were soaked, and exhaustion threatened to creep in, but her mind remained sharp. She had faced extreme danger, been submerged in freezing water, and confronted a coordinated criminal network, and she had prevailed. She looked at Mason Cole, finally seeing the full extent of his desperation and fear. His men were scattered, either unconscious or fleeing, their morale broken. The docks were quiet except for the distant crash of waves and the occasional echo of thunder. Claire's heart rate had returned to a controlled rhythm, her body recovering from the intense physical exertion. Yet she knew this was only a temporary victory. Cole was not a lone threat. His network would not forgive this defeat. Claire took a final deliberate look around the docks, cataloging every escape route, every potential hazard, every vulnerable position. She knew she needed to inform the authorities, but she also knew that she couldn't rely entirely on them. Her skills, her training, her unique ability to remain calm under pressure had been the decisive factor tonight. She would have to anticipate Cole's next move, plan accordingly, and prepare for retaliation. The storm continued to fade into a steady drizzle, and Claire finally allowed herself to step back from the immediate danger. She had turned the tide, but only for now. Mason Cole's arrogance and reach meant that tonight's victory was merely the beginning of a larger, more dangerous battle. Her green eyes reflected the dim light of the storm-laden harbor as she walked slowly toward the safety of the pier's edge. Claire Donovan, Navy SEAL, survivor, strategist, and master of breath and body control, had reclaimed control of the docks. But deep in her mind, she knew that the storm was not over. The real fight was only beginning, and she would meet it head-on, prepared, resolute, and unstoppable. The rain had eased into a gentle drizzle, and the storm-swept harbor was quiet, save for the distant lap of waves against the pilings. Claire Donovan stood at the edge of the dock, her soaked coat clinging to her body, muscles tense but steady, eyes scanning the darkened waters. She had neutralized Mason Cole's immediate threat, but her instincts screamed that the danger was far from over. Victory tonight had been tactical, necessary, yes, but it had not yet uncovered the full extent of his criminal network. Sheriff Miles arrived at the docks, just as Claire was securing the last unconscious men. His expression was a mix of disbelief and concern. The seasoned lawman had known Claire for years as the quiet, capable woman in a small Virginia town, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the scene before him. A storm-battered dock, incapacitated criminals, and Claire standing tall, composed, and terrifyingly efficient. Claire, he began, his voice uncertain, as he surveyed the wreckage. What the hell happened here? Claire's green eyes met his, calm yet commanding. They underestimated me, she said simply. Mason Cole and his men were using the docks for illegal operations. I neutralized them before they could escalate. But this is bigger than you realize. He has a network, and they won't stop here. Sheriff Miles stepped closer, lowering his voice. I've dealt with local crime, but Cole, he's different, dangerous, organized. You didn't just take out a few thugs. You disrupted a whole operation. Are you sure you want to keep going with this on your own? Claire inhaled deeply, letting the cold, humid air fill her lungs. Her mind catalogued the night's events, reviewing every detail. The crates, the movements of Cole's men, the subtle signals in their behavior, the shadows that lingered too long along the docks. She had trained for situations exactly like this, dangerous, unpredictable, and high stakes. And she knew that walking away now would only give Cole the opportunity to regroup and strike back harder. I don't have a choice, Claire said firmly. If I don't follow this through, innocent people get hurt. I can't let that happen. And I won't let him slip away again. Sheriff Miles nodded slowly. He had seen Claire in action before, but tonight had pushed the limits of what he believed possible. He recognized that she was operating on a level beyond ordinary law enforcement, precision, strategy, and training that had been honed to near perfection. Still, he knew she couldn't do this alone. All right, he said finally. We'll work together. But we need evidence, a plan, and backup. Cole won't wait. He'll come at us with everything he's got. Claire's mind raced. She had observed patterns, signals, and subtle clues during the dockside confrontation that hinted at a larger operation. Crates with hidden compartments, coded messages left in shipping logs, and even the timing of the men's patrols all suggested an organized network extending beyond the town. This wasn't just local crime. It was part of something regional, perhaps even national. She moved through the docks methodically, examining every detail. A crate slightly out of alignment revealed a hidden compartment containing shipping manifests. Some entries were innocuous, but others were marked with codes she recognized from her briefings. Years ago, codes associated with smuggling and illegal transactions. Claire's training allowed her to instantly interpret patterns that would elude most people. This isn't just about drugs or weapons, she murmured to herself, tracing the faint markings on the paper. There's coordination, communication, and planning at a level that requires experience to manage. Cole is just the tip of the iceberg. Sheriff Miles watched her quietly, aware that Claire's instincts were rarely wrong. "We need to document everything," he said. "Take photos, collect evidence. If Cole has a network, we can't just take him down in isolation. We need a full case." Claire nodded, already moving to secure the manifests. Her hands were steady, precise, moving with the same efficiency she had shown in combat. Every step was deliberate, ensuring no detail was overlooked. She knew that if she missed something, Cole could exploit it. As they worked, Claire's thoughts returned to the storm, the water, the freezing plunge that had tested her endurance to the extreme. She had survived the trap, but she knew the psychological edge was just as important as physical dominance. Cole's network thrived on intimidation and fear. Breaking that would require more than neutralizing his men. It would require strategy, foresight, and careful dismantling of his operations. By the time they had cataloged the evidence, the first hints of dawn were appearing on the horizon. Gray light reflected off the wet harbor, casting long shadows across the docks. Claire and Sheriff Miles stood side by side, surveying the area. The storm had passed, but the threat remained. Mason Cole had survived the night, and his network was still intact, albeit disrupted. "We need to move quickly," Claire said. "Cole will recover, and his men will regroup. We need to anticipate their next moves, predict their patterns, and hit them where it hurts." Sheriff Miles agreed. "I'll coordinate with the state and federal authorities. But I trust your instincts, Claire. You've handled situations like this before, far worse than this town has ever seen." Claire allowed herself a brief nod, a subtle acknowledgement of both respect and understanding. She had faced extreme danger countless times, and yet each encounter demanded adaptation, precision, and courage. She knew that Cole's network would test her once again, and that failure was not an option. As they left the docks, Claire's mind remained sharp, cataloging details, anticipating moves, and planning strategy. She knew Cole's reach extended far beyond what they had uncovered tonight. Each contact, each shipment, each coded message was a thread in a web that she would unravel, piece by piece. Her gaze lingered on the harbor one last time, the gray waves still churning from the storm. She felt the familiar calm surge within her, the same calm that had carried her through underwater drills, hostile encounters, and life-or-death scenarios. That calm was her greatest weapon, her anchor, and her shield. Claire Donovan had survived the night, turned the tide against Mason Cole, and begun the painstaking process of dismantling his criminal network. But she knew the final confrontation was yet to come. The storm had passed, but the war was far from over, and she would meet it, as she always did, prepared, resolute, and unstoppable. The morning fog hung low over the harbor, casting a gray, ghostly veil over the docks. Claire Donovan moved with quiet precision, boots splashing through puddles, as she approached the warehouse that had served as Mason Cole's nerve center. Rain from the previous night still clung to the wood, and the scent of salt and oil lingered in the air. She had spent the last hours meticulously planning, reviewing evidence, coordinating with Sheriff Miles, and mentally preparing for the final confrontation. Every detail mattered, every sound, every shadow, every possible trap. Inside the warehouse, Mason Cole waited, his face a mask of frustration, anger, and disbelief. He had underestimated Claire Donovan, once, twice even, and now he knew it had been his gravest mistake. His network had been disrupted, his men neutralized, and his shipments confiscated by law enforcement. Yet he refused to surrender. Cole thrived on control, intimidation, and fear, and he believed that his reach could still overpower a single woman. Claire stepped into the main floor, her silhouette framed by the dim light filtering through the warehouse windows. She moved silently, fluidly, her presence commanding even in stillness. Mason's eyes narrowed as he noticed her, recognizing the calm, lethal focus that had thwarted him repeatedly. "You're persistent," he said, voice low and dangerous, echoing off the metal walls. "I'll give you that?" Claire's green eyes met his, unwavering. "Persistence beats arrogance," she replied. "And this ends now, Mason." He lunged first, a desperate swing of a pipe meant to intimidate and overpower. Claire reacted instinctively, sidestepping and letting his momentum carry him forward. Her training had ingrained precision, timing, and adaptability, reflexes honed in freezing waters, combat drills, and high-stress missions. She grabbed his wrist mid-swing, twisting with controlled force, and used it to flip him against a stack of crates. The impact rattled the wood, but Cole was alive, angry, and more dangerous than ever. The fight was physical, brutal, and fast. Mason swung, struck, and lunged, but Claire's movements were calculated, efficient, and economical. Every strike she delivered incapacitated without overextending herself. She had learned that survival wasn't about reckless aggression. It was about control, efficiency, and awareness. Each of Mason's attacks became predictable because her training allowed her to anticipate human patterns under stress. She pivoted, delivering a series of precise blows that left him off balance, then ducked under a wild swing, rolling forward and driving her elbow into his side. Cole grunted in pain, but he wasn't finished. Rage and desperation fueled him, making him unpredictable, dangerous. Yet Claire remained calm. Every breath she took was controlled, deliberate, a tool as lethal as any weapon in her arsenal. "Give it up," she said quietly, her voice carrying authority. "You've lost. You're done." Cole snarled and lunged again, but this time Claire was ready. She anticipated his movement, stepped aside, and used a combination of leverage and momentum to bring him crashing to the ground. The sound echoed through the warehouse, a violent punctuation to the struggle. He struggled beneath her, but Claire's grip and training made resistance futile. Her eyes scanned the room, noting potential hazards, escape routes, and improvised weapons. Every movement was precise, conserving energy while maximizing control. Cole's strength was formidable, but Claire's advantage was skill, timing, and mental dominance. He thrashed, but she remained calm, maintaining her center of gravity, neutralizing each attempt to regain control. Minutes felt like hours as the struggle continued, each second a test of endurance and mental focus. Claire's training in extreme conditions, underwater holds, freezing water immersion, hostile combat scenarios, had prepared her for this moment. She remained focused, breathing deeply, controlling every movement, every strike, every reaction. Finally, with a precise maneuver, she pinned Mason Cole completely, his arms restrained, body immobilized. He gasped, realizing the futility of further resistance. Claire's expression was calm, unyielding, a reflection of the countless hours of discipline, training, and survival instinct that defined her life. "This is over," she said firmly. "You and your network are finished. Surrender or face the consequences." Cole's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The weight of his failures, the disruption of his network, and Claire's unmatched skill left him no choice. He nodded reluctantly, defeated, and finally ceased his struggle. Sheriff Miles entered the warehouse just moments later, flanked by backup law enforcement. His gaze fell on the scene, the defeated Mason Cole, the meticulously controlled environment Claire had established, and her calm, commanding presence. He shook his head in disbelief. "Claire, I don't know how you did this," he said, voice a mixture of awe and concern. Claire turned to him, still alert, still calculating potential threats. "Planning, observation, and control," she replied simply. "You have to anticipate your opponent's moves and exploit their weaknesses. And you can never let fear dictate your actions." The authorities moved quickly, securing Mason Cole and confiscating his remaining equipment and documents. Claire provided detailed evidence, recounting the movements of his network, the locations of shipments, and the strategies they had employed. Her observations were meticulous, leaving law enforcement with a clear path to dismantling the entire operation. Once Cole and his men were in custody, Claire stepped outside into the fresh air. The storm had passed, leaving a gray, muted dawn over the harbor. Rainwater dripped from her hair and clothes, but she felt the familiar calm that always followed survival, the clarity that came from enduring extreme danger and emerging victorious. Sheriff Miles approached, watching her quietly. "You've done more than stop a criminal operation," he said softly. "You've shown what real courage and skill look like. But how do you keep doing this?" Claire smiled faintly, the hint of exhaustion in her expression. "Control, calm, training, knowing that every challenge, no matter how overwhelming, can be overcome if you maintain focus and anticipate the outcome." She paused, eyes scanning the harbor once more. "And remembering that fear is only as powerful as the control you give it." The sun began to pierce through the lingering clouds, casting a pale light over the water. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the rhythm of her pulse, the weight of the night's events, and the assurance that Mason Cole's network was dismantled for now. But she knew that vigilance was a lifelong necessity. Threats, danger, and deception would always exist, and she would always be ready. For Claire Donovan, Navy SEAL, survivor, and master of breath, body, and mind, this victory was another reminder of what she had endured, what she was capable of, and why she could never allow complacency. She had faced extreme danger, cold water, overwhelming numbers, and a cunning criminal mastermind, and she had prevailed. As she walked away from the warehouse, the first rays of sunlight glinting off the wet docks, she felt the familiar sense of calm determination settle over her. The storm had passed, the threat neutralized, and the harbor returned to its quiet, deceptive serenity. But Claire Donovan knew, as she always did, that the world was unpredictable, dangerous, and often unforgiving. And she would face it all with the same unwavering focus, the same controlled breath, and the same indomitable spirit that had carried her through every trial. She disappeared into the early morning mist, leaving behind the chaos, the storm, and the defeated Mason Cole, but carrying with her the certainty that she would always rise to meet the next challenge, unshaken, unstoppable, and alive.